Welcome back to the County Corner. My name is Stephen Aquario. I'm the Executive Director of the New York State Association of Counties. With me here today is David Lucas. He's the Director of Finance and Intergovernmental Relations for the Association of Counties. And we'd also like to thank the Capital District Regional Off-Track Betting Corporation for the opportunity to talk with you here today. Today we're going to talk about taxes. David, this is the time when the United States Congress is trying to frame an issue of tax reform, and we're talking about why this issue of state and local tax deduction matters. So from what we understand, and if we remember back in history, the United States during the Reconstruction era after the Civil War in the late 1800s informed the states that we need to raise revenue to rebuild this great country of ours. And when they did that, they informed the states or worked cooperatively with the states to allow them to deduct any amount of taxation, whether it was raised from property taxes or from state income taxes to help rebuild this nation. It was allowed to be exempt from any federal income tax that might be imposed by the federal government onto the people of this great country. In 1913, when that tax code was formalized and codified in Washington, D.C. and became the law of the land for the people of the state, the deduction continued and has been on the books ever since. So why are we talking about eliminating this provision, and what does it mean to individuals in New York State?
Yeah, it's a great synopsis, Steve. It's the basic definition of federalism, is what you described there. The federal government has said that certain services should be provided at the local level because they're closest to the people, and that's where they should be delivered. And the idea here is that as we raise these taxes, the federal government recognizes we're asking local governments to do certain things, so we're not going to double tax individuals who pay these taxes. The reason we're talking about it now is as Congress goes through a expansive, comprehensive tax reform package, which is needed. We do need federal tax reform, especially on the corporate side. We have some real issues with the rest of the world and the global environment. But what they're proposing to do is to eliminate the state and local tax deduction as something that individuals can deduct when they file their personal income taxes. What it really means, especially in New York, because we have high state and local income taxes, is that you will no longer be able to deduct that. Most homeowners that itemize their deductions in New York, probably 90% or more in a lot of jurisdictions in New York, use the state and local tax deduction. And it's hugely beneficial to New Yorkers just because we do have a high local tax burden. The federal government is changing the deductibility because it raises a lot of revenue for the federal government. And as they raise revenue, they can use that revenue to change some other aspect of the tax code. In this situation, they're lowering tax rates across the board for individuals, but they're also changing tax rates for corporations and the taxes they pay in the future. The problem we have with this right now is New York benefits more than most states from this provision. And will negatively be impacted more. As an individual taxpayer, how you end up from what's been proposed in the House version, which has passed in the House side, it really depends on your individual circumstances. If you're a family that owns a home, the larger your family is, you could end up paying more taxes under these proposals. And even the Joint Committee on Taxation, which is Congress's official scorekeeper on tax bills, has indicated by 2025 and 2027, when we get further out, most taxpayers in the state of New York will be paying more federal income taxes as proposed. And the reason, a big chunk of that reasoning is because of the SALT provision. When we lose that deductibility, we get behind the 8 ball when it comes to federal taxes. So that's why we're talking about it today. It does impact the individual substantially, and we need to address it as we move forward in the legislation.
So, David Lucas from the Association of Counties, we're talking about federal tax reform. We're talking about the state and local tax deduction. You've called it SALT. That's the nickname for it. David, why does this particular issue of the deductibility impact New York State as opposed to Nebraska or Montana or other states. We have 50 states, as we know, and the U.S. territories as well, where taxation is very important. Why isn't this issue the same across the United States? Why does it impact New York more acutely or more severely in a negative way than some of the other states?
I think it was, we touched on it a little bit in your prior segment with County Executive Jimeno. We do rely a lot on local taxes to pay for state and federal programs, more so than other states. In other states, local governments aren't asked to pay a big chunk of Medicaid or other welfare programs or preschool special education or other programs that are quite expensive. And we also have a lot of wealth in the state of New York, especially concentrated in New York City. So we have a very progressive tax system in New York. So we have the ability to tax at the higher end of the income scale. And the state relies pretty heavily on income taxes. And then for what they're not using for income taxes, they're depending on local governments to raise local taxes, whether it be sales, property, or whatever other type of. Some cities have local income taxes. The city of New York does, Yonkers does. They have personal income taxes as well. So we've relied heavily on that source of revenue to pay for state programs and the federal programs that we pay for. And it's not just the Medicaid programs, the welfare programs we talked about. We use this to make sure we have a clean environment. Clean water is a federal requirement. To implement federal labor laws. These are things we do with our local taxes. And we do have a higher tax burden in New York compared to other states. Some states don't even have a personal income tax. And they have relatively low property taxes compared to us. So at the end of the day, we get hit harder than other states. The SALT impact is highest on 6 or 7 states. The rest of the country is not that greatly impacted by this provision. That's why we're so vulnerable today.
David, you've mentioned the use of local taxes to fix infrastructure and provide local services, and state income taxes providing infrastructure programs. And these are programs that the United States government or the federal government would have to pay for, but for the state and the local governments in these cases paying for. So it truly is a matter of fairness from the state's perspective. There's a term that's been used, a balance of payment issue. What does that mean, and why is that affecting New York State more than the other states in the United States?
Yeah, the balance of payments, it's often referred to as a balance of payments deficit in the state of New York in our circumstance. What it is it's a broad measure of the taxes raised on a state-by-state basis and how much of that tax revenue is sent to Washington, and you measure that against how much do you get back in federal outlays. So we pay a lot of federal income taxes. We have high wealth in this state. We have a higher than average median income in this state, so we're paying a lot of federal income tax. It goes to Washington, and from there it gets distributed to other states in federal outlays. What we get back in federal outlays is far less than what we send in tax revenue to the state. In the most recent year, we estimate that about $48 billion in federal taxes goes to Washington that we don't get back in federal outlays. So we're negative $48 billion. And as I said before, that negative balance of payments that we have with the federal government is redistributed to all the other states, which positively impacts their GDP. So when we talk about fairness, we need to look at it in a whole. Right now, we are in a negative fiscal situation with the federal government. That hurts.
What does that mean?
Well, it hurts our ability to spend money locally. Think about that $48 billion that we spent to Washington. What if we could keep that in New York and spend it for local projects or invest it in our economy? That's a disadvantage for New York. And it's not necessarily a bad disadvantage because it means we have a lot of ability to raise revenue in our state because we have a lot of high earners. And we have some very strong pockets to our economy that we can raise revenue from. The disadvantage, though, nationally is our surplus funds are being used to boost the GDP of other states, and that's not fair. These SALT provisions will make it worse from our perspective.
So here we are, shortly after Thanksgiving, the President of the United States saying he wants a bill on his desk by Christmas. Basically less than a month away, Dave, a couple of 3 weeks before the United States Congress will adjourn here. What's next? Where does this issue go from here? And why is this an issue that local government officials are talking about? How does it disrupt a school district financing or a county government's or a town government? How are local government officials tied into this issue?
Yeah, as far as next steps go, the House has passed their version of the bill. The Senate is working on their version this week. It's unclear if they'll be able to pass it this week or maybe early next week. Once the two houses pass their bills, they have to work out their differences because there are some significant differences between the two bills. That would be a conference committee that would have to go back to each chamber to be voted on in the House and the Senate. So they do have a lot of work ahead of them. They also have a lot of work. Funding for the federal government ends next week. They have a lot of other deadlines they have to do while trying to do tax reform at the same time. The impact on individual governments, local governments in New York and nationwide as a whole, with the elimination of the SALT deduction, the local tax becomes more of a burden locally on the taxpayer. And because of that, there's going to be a lot of pressure on local communities and jurisdictions to not raise as much revenue for the services they provide. So school districts are concerned that it's going to put pressure on their ability to raise revenue to support the school system. Counties are going to have the exact same concern. It's especially burdensome for counties because you're mandated to provide these federal and state services, but at the same time, the taxes we use to pay for those services are going to become more negative from an individual taxpayer perspective because they can no longer deduct that. They're paying taxes on taxes they've already paid. First time in our country's history we're going to be in a situation where the federal government is taxing a local tax.
That's the theory of no double taxation,
Yes.
and that's been avoided for hundreds of years. David, what about the issue of home value, second home ownership? Aren't homes funding local government services here? Do you have any concern on home values in this particular case, or people leaving New York State because they can't afford to live here if they can't deduct their school property taxes or their state income taxes?
Yeah, the Association of Realtors in New York nationwide has raised this as a big concern. The builders as well too, the building trades. In addition to eliminating the state and local tax deduction, they're also limiting mortgage interest deduction in the House bill, which the realtors are concerned it could impact house values in the near term to as much as a 10% reduction in home value, because it's an economic factor that someone considers when they buy a house. How much can I afford my monthly payment? Well, part of my monthly payment is, mortgage. Part of it's property tax. Well, if I can't deduct the property tax anymore, do I want to buy a home of this value, or am I going to limit myself and say, well, no, I can't pay that much for a home anymore? So it will have some impact on real estate in the short term. Over the long term, I think it's unclear. But there are concerns there that we should watch.
Thank you very much. We've been joined by David Lucas of the Association of Counties. Let's hope our New York congressional delegation can convince the other men and women in the United States Congress and the United States Senate, the House of Representatives, to protect the interests of New York and its local governments. Thank you very much, David Lucas.
Thank you.